This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Today, some straight talk from a couple of former Democratic congressmen. Tom Allen from Maine argues that bad things happen when lawmakers ignore evidence. And Mike Barnes of Maryland, a foreign policy expert, says we need to rethink our policy toward Cuba and the rest of Latin America. And Bill Press talks with new Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Tom Allen is a former congressman from Maine who has written a book about why Congress is broken. Not surprisingly, he makes the argument that Republicans and their disregard for evidence of what works is to blame. And we're joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by Tom Allen, former Democratic congressman from Maine's 1st Congressional District. He served from 1997 to 2009. He is currently president and CEO of the American Association of Publishers and the author of the book Dangerous Convictions, which is a book that's highly critical of the way Congress works. Tom Allen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's a real pleasure.
So your new book about Congress, called Dangerous Convictions, as I mentioned, why did you decide to write it, and why now?
Well, to take the second question first, I've been writing this over almost 4 years, since I lost the race for the U.S. Senate in November of 2008. And I started writing this out of frustration at the way Congress is covered, both by the mainstream media, which tends to cover Congress by just reporting what each side says, and also by the partisan media, which really doesn't allow people who are struggling to understand to get as much as they could if it were a little bit better. But so my basic complaint was that the coverage I felt of the media of Congress was too shallow, that it neglected ideas, especially how those ideas that are bundled into worldviews that I came to believe when I was in Congress really shaped the opinions of the Republicans and the Democrats. We always seem to be arguing the same fundamental thing. What should government do? What should it not do? No matter what the issue was. And so that's how I got into the book, and I became convinced that some convictions are dangerous when they simply are held despite contrary evidence.
And we've seemed to have seen a lot of that over the last several years. You argue that the problem is that the two parties in Congress no longer merely disagree. They look at each other as visitors from another planet. Is Congress irredeemably broken?
Well, not in the long term, but it sure feels as if the short term is not going to change very soon, that it's incredibly difficult. And I think that they do look at each other, the parties do look at the other side as coming from another planet. I think basically Republicans believe that government is, by its very nature, it infringes on personal liberty. It fosters dependency in the population, and it screws up about everything it does. And Democrats still see government as a way of furthering the interests of all, and a way of providing opportunity for people who don't have the advantages of others. Democrats look at Republicans, I think, consequently, as being, basically, not believing what they are saying and taking care of their own funders, I guess I would say. And Republicans look at Democrats and say, well, they're just pandering to the people. And in that respect, what Mitt Romney said about Obama promising gifts to the people is clarifying, I think. But I think we can get out of this. It's just a very long haul, because the American population is getting sorting itself into these two parties, each side convinced it's right, each side that every election, if they had lost the last one, they're going to take back America. And we need to sort of get our bearings here and try to understand the other side, but also to make Congress work for the 21st century. It's not going to be smaller in any sense that would satisfy the current Republicans.
We're speaking with Tom Allen, former Democratic congressman from Maine, president and CEO of the American Association of Publishers and author of the book Dangerous Convictions. What do you see as some of the greatest challenges facing the new Congress?
Well, the most immediate one has been the most immediate one for some time, and that is, how do we deal with the budget and tax structure that we have? The Bush tax cuts basically drove us deep into annual deficit. That's the primary factor, even larger than the recession. Drove us deep into annual deficits and expanded the national debt, and we've got to dig our way out of that. And that whole controversy is going to come up over and over again in the coming years, both in the near term and in the long term. One other challenge is, of course, the whole debate over immigration. I think now that, given the outcome of the 2012 election, I think even Republicans will have some interest in trying to resolve that particular issue. And a third, just to pick one that I believe is critically important, is climate change. And there, my guess is that although Congress should be dealing with that issue, the Obama administration will have to do most of the work on its own. But in the long run, the denial of the scientific consensus that climate change is occurring, that it's driven primarily by greenhouse gas emissions, and that it raises just tremendous complications and problems for the future. That scientific consensus needs to be accepted by Republicans. I don't expect it to happen right away, but Congress can't escape dysfunctionality until that happens.
Mm-hmm. Now, although your service was in the House, do you think the main obstacle to getting anything done in Washington is the Senate filibuster?
Well, I think it's an obstacle, a significant obstacle, because it empowers the minority in the Senate to stop a lot of things from happening at all. And I do believe it ought to be modified significantly. But for me, the primary obstacle to getting anything done in Washington is that we have become separated by worldviews. And one worldview is grounded in self-reliance, the quintessential American virtue, the other in community, which is our practice of cooperation and working together for common goals. And if one party represents essentially a libertarian view, the government is always bad, and the other party is trying to work through government, as Republicans did in the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, even with the Reagan administration to some extent. As long as that continues, we're in a lot of trouble, a whole lot of trouble.
We're speaking with Tom Allen, former Democratic congressman from Maine, president and CEO of the American Association of Publishers, and author of the book Dangerous Convictions. You were a member of Congress from Maine for 12 years. When and why did the state go from rock-ribbed Republican in presidential elections to pretty solidly blue?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with what was happening to the Republican Party. I mean, when Richard Nixon adopted the Southern strategy, and in successive elections for several decades, you had a Republican Party sort of appealing to what some call the Christian right, and stirring up issues of abortion and gay rights, and gay marriage, immigration, those sorts of things. That's when Maine, kept moving left, because Mainers really, at bottom, I think the state is an independent state, but it cares a lot about the personal freedoms, and therefore we don't buy into that part of the Republican Party that is predominantly concerned with conservative social issues. And that's why I think, this is not just about Maine, but it's also about, the rest of New England and much of the Middle West.
Even the Republican senators from Maine can be fairly moderate to progressive on some issues. The new senator, Angus King, is even an independent. How do you think this former governor will do in the Senate, and will he waver between the Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I think he'll do fine. I mean, I've known Angus for years. I consider him a friend. I think he will do a very good job. In Washington, he's really a Democrat. I mean, he will, I'm sure, try to find some ways to reach out to Republicans, but he is liberal on social issues. He's a fiscal conservative, but he's not, he's not with the Republicans on their approaches to taxes and that they have shown so far. So I think he will reach out to Republicans to some extent, but I think he'll vote more like a Democrat than someone in the absolute middle.
Is it people like an Angus King, independents that might go either way in terms of how they vote? Is that maybe that's what Congress needs to get itself kind of righted back and less dysfunctional? Do you need more people like that?
I think it's hard to get more people like that. I think that really a few individuals aren't going to change this around. I think there needs to be a systematic effort on both sides to spend more time with each other, but that's not the major thing. The major thing is the Republican Party has to go through a process, and my guess is it takes 10 years, of trying to figure out what kind of government they support in the 21st century. A government that doesn't see an agenda for Republicans. It doesn't see government as evil in itself, but as capable of doing those things that the private sector can't handle, and that only government leadership can foster. I think they've got to go through a long and difficult process, but that's what it takes. I just don't think that the middle by itself, a few more people in the middle by themselves, will make a change. This is fundamental. This is kind of, the Republican Party is going through an identity crisis, and it's not going to resolve it in a year or two, but it's going to take a while. At the end of the day, well, I am a Democrat, and I want Democrats, I support a Democratic agenda. I do think the country needs a more pragmatic Republican Party, that this dysfunction, this polarization is not healthy.
I think there are plenty of Democrats that would agree with you on that one. Tom Allen, former Democratic congressman from Maine's 1st Congressional District, currently president and CEO of the American Association of Publishers and author of the book Dangerous Convictions. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Former Maryland Congressman Mike Barnes is a foreign policy expert who says that after more than half a century of trying to isolate Cuba, America needs to be flooding the island with tourists and businessmen and women. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The word of the day is boom. Yes, boom times are upon us again. The stars came into alignment, marveled one financial manager. Corporate confidence returns, applauded a recent headline. We're finally dusting off the cobwebs, rejoiced a business analyst, pointing out that banks are willing to take risks. Well, it's about time that bankers and CEOs began turning loose of some of the trillions of dollars they've been hoarding. Since the crash of 2008, grassroots America has been starved of investment and job-creating enterprises. So any sign of that long-dormant capital finally beginning to move would be splendid news indeed, except for this nagging question: where's the money going? Hint, not to you. The big money is not being invested in job growth, grassroots enterprise, new products, or anything else that would improve your family's economic prospects. Rather, this boom is truly explosive, a job-destroying financial flim-flam known grandly as the corporate merger. It amounts to nothing more than one giant corporation taking over another, or even a corporation taking over itself. The mega merger is back, exclaimed the New York Times. I'll say, already this year, $11 billion was spent to merge U.S. Air into American Airlines. Warren Buffett and a Brazilian buyout group threw $23 billion into the purchase of ketchup peddler H.J. Heinz. And Michael Dell amassed $24 billion to buy his namesake computer outfit, which he already was in charge of and owned the biggest chunk of. This is Jim Hightower saying this buyout boom is a boon to the financial hucksters and top executives who profit from the deals, but merger mania cuts jobs, shrinks competition, raises consumer prices, concentrates wealth in fewer hands, and diverts capital from productive enterprises. What a deal for America!
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you: the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. How do you hasten the end of Cuba's dictatorship? Former Congressman Mike Barnes, an expert on Latin America, says send cruise ships full of tourists, send business leaders. He argues that an influx of American dollars makes it less possible for a dictatorship to survive. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Mike Barnes is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. As a former congressman from Maryland, he's an expert on domestic issues as well as a specialist on Latin American affairs. In the 1980s, Mike was appointed by President Reagan to the Kissinger Commission on Central America, and after his congressional service, he was president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Mike Barnes, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Always happy to be with fellow Democrats.
Yeah, indeed. Let's talk about Latin America today. What does President Obama's reelection portend for U.S. relations with the region?
Well, I hope that it portends more engagement. Understandably, the United States has had its attention focused elsewhere for a long time now, really, with the problems in the Middle East and challenges in Asia and around the world. We haven't given attention that I believe we ought to our neighbors here in the hemisphere. So I hope that the President and his team will focus intensely. Obviously, they got to focus on all these other things, continue to, but I hope they'll also focus intensely on our relationships with our neighbors throughout all the hemisphere and the Caribbean, because there's a lot going on in this hemisphere, and the United States hasn't been paying enough attention.
Does the new U.S. foreign policy emphasis on Asia detract from attention that should be paid to Latin America?
Well, it shouldn't have to. We ought to be able to walk and chew gum. We ought to be able to focus on Asia, which is so important, obviously, but at the same time be able to direct our attention to the challenges right here in our front yard. One possible success, I think, for the Obama second administration would be a change in our policy with respect to Cuba, which is an irritant with all of our neighbors. I don't know that we can have another summit of the Americas without Cuba there, because everybody else in the hemisphere wants them there. Everybody else has relations with them. Our policy, I think it's pretty clear, hasn't worked. We've been trying to get the Castros out of Cuba by isolating them now since 1959, and if you've tried a policy for 50, 60 years and it hasn't worked. Maybe it's time to think about trying something different. And I would hope that President Obama would during this next term and maybe even in this next year move to change our policy with respect to Cuba, and I think that would be a very positive thing that ultimately would actually be more successful at changing what's going on in Cuba than what we've been trying to do for all these decades.
And I'm glad you brought it up because I had Cuba on the list of things to talk to you about. Should we take Cuba off the list of states that sponsor terrorism?
I think we can. I think the history of the last years is that Cuba has not been engaged in international terrorism, and that would be one of the steps that the United States could take to change the dynamic with Cuba. We ought to be, instead of restricting how many people can go there, we ought to be flooding them with tourists and with business people. And I remember Lech Walesa was asked after the revolution in Poland that overthrew the communists, what advice would you give to the Cuban Americans in Miami? He was asked by the Cuban Americans in Miami, what advice would you give us about how we could change things in Cuba? And he said, once Poland was opened up to Western influences, it was virtually impossible for the communists to keep the lid on. And he recommended, open it up, have trade with them, have family exchanges, have tourism, et cetera, et cetera. If all the cruise ships were going to Havana, that would change the atmosphere in Havana rather quickly, I think.
Yeah, things like that I would think would improve economics for a lot of people, for whether you're an American or a Cuban. I mean, it just makes sense, right? We're working with them.
Well, the American business community generally would like to see the opportunity to trade with Cuba. There are business opportunities there. Cuba's a poor country, obviously, but there are real opportunities for American agriculture and American business to trade with Cuba and make some money. And the more of that happens, the less possible it will be for a dictatorship like they have in Cuba to survive. If they're overrun with Western business types and tourists and et cetera, it's be very tough for them to sustain the kind of clamped down dictatorship that they have.
Are you disappointed with the Obama administration's failure to close Guantanamo and his continuing support for rendition and military trials of suspected terrorists?
I understand the difficulties the president has with these issues, but sure, I think probably most Americans are disappointed that more hasn't been able to be done in that area, and we all hope that more will be able to be done during this second term, possibly early in the second term. I'm sure the president is very disappointed because he understands the both real and symbolic implications of these policies. They're harmful to the United States, and I'm sure nobody understands that better than the president of the United States, who campaigned 4 years ago on a commitment to make some changes. It's been very tough to do, and it's going to continue to be tough to do. The closing of Guantanamo, the opposition to bringing those prisoners to anywhere else has been extremely strong, particularly from our Republican friends. So it hasn't been easy to accomplish some of the things the president wants to do, but I hope we can move in the right direction.
We're speaking with Mike Barnes, Senior Fellow with the Center for International Policy, former Congressman from Maryland. Moving down now to South America, what do you think, just kind of have a forward look here, what will Venezuela look like after Chavez?
Well, Venezuela has a lot going for it, and Chavez has undermined what could potentially be a strong economy, and there are a lot of potential. There are a lot of people in Venezuela, a lot of very sophisticated, highly educated, capable people that can step forward in the post-Chavez era to make Venezuela the country it ought to be. I've visited there many times, and it's really very sad to see the way that economy has been ruined, really, by the policies of Chavez. So I have a lot of optimism about Venezuela going forward, because got a lot of friends there who are extremely competent, both in the education world and in the business community, and Venezuela ought to right now ought to be doing extremely well. I mean, you look at some of its neighbors that have improved so much. Brazil, Argentina is struggling; they've got an incompetent government. So I'm hopeful that after Chavez, Venezuela will begin to get moving.
Now, speaking of one of Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia has been racked by a long-running civil war. Does the Obama administration have a legitimate role to play here?
Well, we ought to be supporting the Colombians in their efforts. Colombia is another country that has potentially a great future. The drug issue has decimated that society in so many ways, but it's gotten better. In the last 3 or 4 years, things have really picked up in Colombia, and again, there's some reason for optimism, and I hope that the United States can play a very positive role, throughout all of Latin America. The election 4 years ago of President Obama raised real hopes that the U.S. would take a more engaged approach to our friends in Latin America, and I hope with his re-election it'll be fulfilled.
You know, when you think about it, and we're in the worst financial time since the Great Depression, as the president comes into office, and then of course, obviously, the next 4 years weren't a lot of fun. The economy is better now. Certainly has a ways to go. Does that help? Does that take some things off his plate, perhaps, to where maybe he can spend a little bit more effort and time looking at Latin America?
Well, I hope he can. I hope he will. He's got a tough agenda right here out of the box. We've got, the economic battles. The Republicans want to hold the economy of the world hostage on debt ceilings, and they want, they want to make. Use every opportunity to undermine the efforts of the administration to get the economy into a higher gear. Plus, you've got tough issues like gun control and immigration. They're going to be extremely difficult. So the president's got more than a full plate. But Latin America is so important, and he's got some capable people on his team dealing with these issues. And John Kerry, the new and Secretary of State, cares a lot about the region and is knowledgeable about it, and I would expect he'll play a huge role in helping to increase our engagement.
And then before we let you go, what's the picture of human rights in Latin America right now? What does the future realistically hold?
Well, it's a lot better. The human rights situation in Latin America is a lot better today than it was when I was chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee in the House back in the 80s. When we had dictatorships all over the place. I was dealing with Pinochet in Chile and the generals in Argentina, and things were much worse. They were throwing people out of airplanes in Guatemala, the Guatemalan army. I mean, literally taking labor organizers up in helicopters and throwing them out alive, killing them. Things are not terribly rosy everywhere in Latin America today, but it is so much better than it was. Terrific progress has been made, and that ought to be acknowledged and built on, because there's a lot of democratic reality in Latin America today that wasn't there 20 years ago. There's still huge challenges, but the future ought to be continuing to improve.
Former Congressman from the great state of Maryland, Mike Barnes, a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. Mike, as always, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin, the day before sequestration took effect.
Well, depending on whose clock you're paying attention to, it is either midnight tonight or midnight tomorrow night. There's a dispute about exactly when the sequester kicks in, but it looks like it will kick in unless today something can happen in the Senate and then move over to the House. We're going to check on that and a whole lot of other issues with a good friend of the program and a very, very excited new member of the United States Senate from the state of Wisconsin. We strongly supported her. So did all of you. As she joins us now, Senator Tammy Baldwin. Hey, Senator, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Great to join you.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's start with this week. Chris Christie made news when he became the 8th Republican governor to support the expansion of Medicaid here in New Jersey. He said it's a good deal for taxpayers of New Jersey. If it's good for the taxpayers of New Jersey, why isn't it good for the taxpayers of Wisconsin, Senator?
Well, that's the question we've all been asking because our governor announced last week that he is rejecting Medicaid expansion for our state. And I've concluded that it appears to be a political decision, not a sound policy decision. It just doesn't add up if you think about the fact that a significant number of Wisconsinites, the most vulnerable Wisconsinites, will be getting inferior health coverage. We are foregoing about $10 billion of federal funding over a long period of time for the most vulnerable people in our state. And it's going to cost state taxpayers more for this alternative that our governor's proposed, which, again, is wholly inadequate. But, you know, there's a pattern here. A few months before that, our governor rejected the prospect of putting together a state insurance exchange and instead punted it to the federal government where we won't have the opportunity to make it as specific to our needs in Wisconsin. And prior to that, the governor asked our state attorney general to join the lawsuit, trying to bring down the Affordable Care Act. So it's act after act, and there's a pattern developing here, which is why I think this is politics and not doing what's right for the people of the state. And it's really time, it's overdue to start working together and start making the Affordable Care Act work for the people of Wisconsin.
And it's interesting that Scott Walker joins Bobby Jindal and Bob McDonnell from Virginia, Bobby Jindal, Louisiana, of course, Bobby John from Virginia, and Rick Perry from Texas. There's 3 other governors who also, it seems, are playing politics on this issue. So on the sequester, Senator, will there be any action in the Senate today on this issue to try to head off the sequester?
Yes, there will, and we're spending the day, and in terms of preparation, it's been the last several weeks to put together something that's balanced to avert these arbitrary, across the board, very damaging cuts that economists have told us will greatly reduce our growth in the country over the year to come, and will lead to the unemployment of up to 2 million people nationwide. I mean, it's staggering when you look at what's being what we're being warned about. So it's also high time that we stop living crisis to crisis, fiscal cliff to fiscal cliff. And so the Senate, the Democrats are proposing a balanced package that relies on a combination of smart spending cuts, very targeted, closing some wasteful corporate tax loopholes and subsidies, and making sure that everyone does their fair share in this situation, including the Buffett rule is part of our package. And I highlight that since last session I authored the Buffett rule in the House of Representatives. Now I'm working with Sheldon Whitehouse in the Senate to make that a piece of our solution to this problem.
So it will be part of the Senate bill passed today, do you believe?
It will be, it's part of our strategy to say we got to have balance as we move forward, and that it recognizes that our country faces two challenges: getting our economy back on track and responsibly reducing our deficit. So we have to make sure that everyone has a fair shot and that everyone does their fair share. That's what the Buffett rule is all about.
That's what the Buffett rule absolutely is all about. Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, our guest here on our Newsline this morning on the Full Court Press. Senator, we learned earlier today on the show from Congresswoman Donna Edwards that John Boehner has said the Congress is going home today. They're done. They're not going to be here tomorrow. So even if the Senate acts today, the House won't be here to act tomorrow. So we're going to see the sequester, aren't we?
I fear that will be the case, and I was beginning to predict that in the last couple of weeks, having heard Speaker Boehner make several comments about not being willing to negotiate, but I think when it takes effect and people begin to see its effects, there will be an even louder insistence as House members go home and hear from their constituents that they return and get something done. So I fear, as most do, that it'll go into effect, but hopefully just for a few days, maybe a week or two, and then some sense gets, some common sense is grabbed in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, particularly because within a month, it may take until the 1st of April for the cuts to be felt, but they are real and they will cause real pain. And
we were talking about living from crisis to crisis, which has frustrated so many Americans. There's another crisis looming, and that's March 27th, when the what's known as the continuing resolution that's funding our government expires. That could be a government shutdown. So you have the furlough notices that are going out now. You have all of this. I think what I hope is that this month we make a commitment to stop living crisis to crisis and get back to governing and budgeting the way the federal government is supposed to, and that requires some leadership, and that's what we're going to do today in the Senate, and we're going to continue to do. But we need a partner over in the House.
Now, on another issue, and this is an issue you've been out in front on, Senator, the Violence Against Women Act, which did pass the Senate, finally comes up for a vote today in the House of Representatives. They could have done it months ago, but they're doing it today, and it looks like we're going to see that pass and sent to the president, right?
It looks very encouraging, and there's been a couple of breakthroughs recently where gridlock was reached last session, and let's hope that's a sign of hope. Yeah,
right. That people maybe apply that same coming together on other issues that they did on the violence against women. It's just sorry that too bad it took so long to get there. And before we let you go, I just want to ask you too. Yesterday, it was very interesting. Well, a couple of days ago, and I'm talking about marriage equality now, and this big case that's two cases in front of the Supreme Court. A few days ago, 80 leading Republicans came out and signed an amicus brief in front of the Supreme Court saying you have to overturn DOMA. Yesterday, a whole group of major corporations, from the biggest names in corporate America, Microsoft and Apple, and a lot of others, those corporations filed a brief with the Supreme Court saying this is bad for business not to support marriage equality. So it looks like, Senator, the tide's turning here in terms of public opinion.
Absolutely. I have seen a steady growth in support for marriage equality and opposition to discrimination. Just during my time in the House, and these pieces of news in my early days in the Senate are very heartening. I still recall the interview that our president gave last year, talking about how his views and opinions have changed. And I think that this is happening throughout the country, and it's not partisan. You are hearing from, as you said, 80-plus prominent Republicans who are now saying that marriage equality is, that Proposition 8 should be overturned, that DOMA should be repealed, and it's I think reflective of the opinions of the country. Unfortunately, as these cases play out, we still have Speaker Boehner sort of leading the effort to defend DOMA and spending taxpayer dollars for attorneys to do so. He's sort of out of the mainstream now.
Yeah, that's amazing, and how public opinion has changed on this for the better. It's just great. So, Senator, you're busy on many fronts.
Yes, indeed.
You jumped right into all of these important issues, and that's great. And it's great to have you in the United States Senate. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in studio one of these days.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Senator Tammy Baldwin.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Tom Allen, Mike Barnes, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org